So the End of Life Choice Bill is a bill that will give people who are very ill at the end of their life choice about how they go and when they go. Currently, it is illegal under the Crimes Act to assist someone in ending their life. That's what the Susan Austin case that's recently been reported on was all about. Somebody provided another person with the means to help end their life. We want to give an exemption to that law under very strict circumstances. So you have to be terminally ill, dying within 6 months on prognosis, or you have to have a grievous and irremediable condition in an advanced state of decline. So you're very bad and getting worse. So conditions such as Huntington's disease, for instance. So you have to have one of those conditions. You have to be 18, you've got to be a New Zealand citizen or permanent resident, you have to be judged by 2 doctors to have one of those conditions and be capable of understanding the decision you're making. So if you can't understand the full implications of the decision of having an assisted death, then you will not be allowed to make that decision.
Why do people want it?
Oh, because people have grown up and watched relatives often have absolutely harrowing deaths where they, basically would have been quite happy to leave out the last 5 or 10 days of just terrible, undignified suffering that is needless. And I say 10 days because when the Quebec Select Committee studied assisted dying in Europe, where it's legal in some countries, they discovered that 10 days is the average length that someone actually shortens their life by.
But what is and isn't euthanasia in this case?
Well, there's a whole lot of things that people do that are not assisted dying. So people can refuse treatment, they can refuse food and water. Those things are totally unsafeguarded, they lead to death, and they happen quite often. People can commit amateur violent suicide without the help or knowledge of anyone else, and a significant portion of people do that. People end up just suffering to the bitter end. That's not euthanasia, that's just suffering. Where it's interesting is medical school research from the University of Auckland finds that 4.5% of deaths in New Zealand from doctors deliberately giving drugs to end a patient's life early. Now, I would say that is involuntary, informal euthanasia. It's happening right now. What my bill allows is for a person who is mentally competent to make a choice for themselves. The amount of suffering that goes on, the amount of indignity, the experiences that people have show that our laws currently do not work. And you can actually break it down 3 ways. The moral case is, why do we allow all those other choices? Amateur violent suicide, informal euthanasia, do not resuscitate, refusing food and water and treatment. We allow all of those pretty grotty options, but we don't allow someone to go through a legally safeguarded process where they can make the choice. So that's the moral case. The legal case is that in the Lucretia Seales versus Attorney General court case, the judge ruled that he basically said in judge language, I would like to allow Lucretia Seales to have her own choice, but that would be, quote, trespassing on the realm of Parliament. So the judge said Parliament must act if this is going to change. And finally, the democratic case is that consistently 3/4 of New Zealanders tell reputable pollsters, including the ones that got last year's election result right, that they would like choice, whereas only about 20% on a good day will say that they're opposed.
Is this going to be another thing where New Zealand is sort of amongst the first in the world, another progressive nature thing like gay marriage or the women's vote?
No, I mean, there are currently 120 million people in the world who live in a country where assisted dying is legal. In the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Bolivia of all places, Canada, California, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Vermont, the Australian state of Victoria. About 120 million people live under assisted dying laws as they stand.
The notion of choice, obviously central to this idea of euthanasia and assisted suicide. Society limits choice as it is, so why is there a push for choice in this realm? Why is it so important?
Well, I think I come back to the fact that it could be you. I hope that you die at 100 years old of a heart attack in your sleep, and everyone shows up to your funeral to say what a great guy Jake was. But what if you're one of those people who develops a condition that is going to lead to a painful and undignified death that cannot be helped by palliative care, and there are such people. That was accepted in the Lucretia Seals case, for one. And you basically have choices of amateur violent suicide, suffering till the bitter end, having informal euthanasia by a doctor where you're not in control. That's cruel. Why should you, as someone who's lived a self-determining life, a proud life, who's made the right choices, not harmed anyone, not be able to have choice about how you go and when you go? It's your life and it's your choice.
Suffering that you deem intolerable, what does that mean?
Well, that depends on the person, and it's very critical that only the person in question can make the choice. If they don't believe that the suffering is intolerable and cannot be alleviated in any other way, then they are eligible to apply to doctors to see if they fit the other criteria.
We asked many 18-year-olds, and of course 18-year-olds the lowest amongst that safeguard group. They didn't know what the words grievous and irremediable meant. They knew they meant harm and you can't come back from. They didn't know what it means. What do those words mean?
So grievous means that it is very severe, and irremediable means that it can't be fixed. So, if you look at someone with Huntington's disease, is it irremediable? Absolutely. There sadly is no cure for Huntington's, and it's it's grievous in the sense that it severely affects a person. It means that they will eventually die from their own muscles choking them.
People say this bill is too broad, specifically Simon O'Connor. The worst example in the world, he said a few speeches after you when this bill was first read. What do you say to those that say this is such a broad bill?
Well, it's just not true. This bill is more conservative than some of the bills that have been passed around the world. It's more liberal than others. For example, this bill allows you to have doctor-assisted suicide, where the doctor will inject or give you the means to end your life, as opposed to you having to do it entirely by yourself. And that's important for some people who have become so degenerative that they can't do it for themselves. So in that sense, it's a bit more liberal. In other senses, we don't allow advanced directives. You can't, write down, as you can in some of the Benelux countries, if I get to a certain stage, I want someone else to make a decision for me. I rejected that. I said this has to be entirely about choice. So this is middle of the range. I mean, people like Simon O'Connor get very exercised, but on the facts, they're just wrong.
Why are we talking about both euthanasia and assisted suicide? Why is that the better case to go with?
Well, as I just said, I think it's because there are people who will get to a certain stage. Look at Rachel Reitmer. You can see videos of her that she's made in her support of having choice and of the bill passing. She's got to a stage with Huntington's where it's quite difficult for her to do a lot of things. She may not be able to use assisted dying under a law that requires her to do it entirely herself, but her mind is absolutely fine. She knows exactly what she's doing. She knows exactly what she wants. Why shouldn't she be able to be helped?
Can you describe the safeguards for this bill?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go through the section 4 of the bill, which outlines the definition of a person who qualifies for assisted dying. So first of all, you've got to be 18. You've got to be a New Zealand citizen or permanent resident, so you can't, we're not going to have medical tourism here. You've got to have, as I've said, either a terminal illness with a prognosis of less than 6 months, or a grievous and irremediable condition that is irreversible and in an advanced state of decline and capability. So that wipes out the vast majority of people at any given time. Most people just don't have a condition anything like that. You have to be judged to be capable of understanding the nature of assisted dying and the choice that you're making. So that means that somebody who is severely depressed, well, by definition, they have a distorted view of the value of life and the real implication of death. So you've got to be of sound mind, and all of that has to be judged by two doctors, except for the part about mental capability. That may also be judged by a psychiatrist if the doctor has any doubt. Now you've got to remember that if the doctors fail to follow any of this, they are liable. So doctors, if anything, are going to err on the side of being conservative. I think it's likely that there's going to be a lot of criticism of the bill, that it actually is too difficult for some people to access who would like to use it. And obviously people will criticise you from both directions, but I think it's a sign that we've got it about right. Allowing somebody to decide for themselves is at the very core of this legislation. It's about choice. It's not about somebody making a decision for you or doing something for you. You have to decide that this is what you want. You have to initiate. You have to ask for it. You have to ask for it several times throughout the process. You can pull out at any time during the process. So this is fundamentally about a person's choice.
The idea of compassion, because I suppose that compassion is at the heart of this bill as well, is to relieve those of pain. Can you talk about compassion in relevance to this bill?
Yeah, so there's a bit of a balance actually, in that while I view it as being primarily about choice. If it was really all about choice, we would just say you can buy whatever you like anywhere. And people just go into a dairy and buy suicide pills. I mean, that's obviously not what we're talking about. So the choice is essential, but it's not everything. You need to be able to show that you are in a category of people who we believe will suffer, and you've got to confirm that you believe that you are someone who's suffering. So one of the motivations is actually to reduce needless suffering by people at the end of their lives, so that they can actually take control and choose how they go and when they go.
Many people will argue under the compassion side that if an 18-year-old is eligible, what differentiates an 18-year-old from a 17-year-old's pain?
Yeah, and again, that you've got to make these trade-offs. That comes back to the choice side of it. So there will be people who will tell you, well, it should be allowed to use it at 16. The Attorney General actually said that my bill is too restrictive and discriminates against 16 and 17-year-olds. My answer to that is you've got to choose an age, and I think 18 is the age that is most widely accepted as being the age of adulthood. A lot of laws are like this. There are things that children would like to do and we don't let them because we don't think that they're mature enough to do it. Does that mean that some 16 and 17-year-olds may suffer and not have relief from this bill? Yes, it does. Is that a necessary part of lawmaking? I'm afraid it is.
Belgium never intended for children to be eligible for this. Do you intend for children to be eligible for this in the end?
Well, no, I don't. But this is the kind of argument that you get from people who have lost every other argument. So they say, we don't have any objections to what you're proposing, so we're going to argue about some other scenario that's not being proposed. I have no intention that people who are not able to make a choice for themselves will ever be able to access my bill. The best data we have shows that about a third of doctors are in favour. No doctor, according to the legislation, will be compelled to fulfil a role under the Act. They can make a conscientious objection at any time. Incidentally, 2/3 of nurses are in favour, and they're a lot closer to the coalface with this stuff. So that doesn't surprise me. A lot of doctors, of course, if you're an ophthalmologist, for example, are never going to have anything to do with this bill. So it's just not true that doctors are opposed. The New Zealand Medical Association executive is opposed, but just remember they represent about 20% of all doctors in New Zealand, and they've never even surveyed the ones they do represent. So to say that doctors are opposed, there's just no basis for that.
You sit in the House of Representatives and you mentioned in your speech that there is a overwhelming support for euthanasia. Is this your duty to be taking this forward?
Well, there's overwhelming support for the choice. Okay, just remember, this is about choice. It's not about whether you're for or against assisted dying. I don't even know if I would ever use it, to be quite honest. It's about having the choice. And yes, I think when 75% of New Zealanders say they want Parliament to do something, and when the judge confirms that only Parliament can act, then I think somebody in the House has to stand up for that. And, you know, I'm very sincere about this. I mean, John Key asked me to be a minister. You know, I turned down a $50,000 pay rise, the title of honourable and the limousines and all the other stuff, the power and everything else that goes with that, because as a minister I would not have been able to advance a private member's bill.
You said to Duncan Garner on the AM show that there is a lot of fear-mongering out there. There's people who, for various motivations, will say all sorts of things that aren't true about what happens overseas, and obviously we've mentioned of Simon O'Connor. What is the fear-mongering that is happening?
Oh, I'll give you one real simple example. You know, there is a story doing the rounds that people in the Netherlands wear wristbands that say "Do not euthanize me," because they are so afraid that if they go into a hospital they're going to somehow be euthanized, which is crazy. I mean, it's illegal, it doesn't happen, and you think, where did this story come from? Well, Rick Santorum, who's one of these absolutely sort of nutty extremist politicians in the US, was giving a speech and he just thought he'd slip that in. Now, of course, that story spread. It's a sort of a viral story. It's a good example of how a lie can travel twice around the world while the truth is getting its laces done up.
I'm wondering whether you saw the Stuff article not too long ago about the Catholic Church in Hamilton. Did you see that?
Yeah, I think I might have been quoted in it.
Right. Now, so that article mentioned of, well, the headline Catholic Church fear-mongering in Hamilton, putting out gluten intolerance in a newsletter. A group like that, are they within their rights to be doing something like that?
Oh, absolutely. Look, we're a free society. People have got the right to say whatever they think is best for them to say. But the other thing about freedom of speech is I've got the right to say that anyone who says that is completely wrong. They've misunderstood the facts. They haven't read the bill, because as far as I'm aware, no one with gluten intolerance could ever say they were in an advanced state of decline, irreversible decline in capability, so they'd be struck out of accessing my bill, even if they could prove that it was a grievous and irremediable condition, which I think would be a major stretch. And I suspect that somebody that thought that would have real issues with demonstrating to a doctor or a psychiatrist that they had the mental capability to understand what they were doing.
Is there a bias from members of Parliament from their religious views specifically?
Well, I think, I don't want to get into attacking people's personal convictions. I mean, people have a right to those. But I do think it's interesting that if you watch, I think there is a total of 12 speeches, maybe 13 in the end, the Speaker extended it a bit, on the bill, and all of the anti-speakers are people that we know have deep-seated, hard on their sleeve religious convictions. Not one of them mentioned that in their speech. I just find that interesting, particularly when the Hamilton Catholic Church you referenced earlier has told people to avoid making religious arguments when they argue against my bill. Now, I'm not an expert in the Catholic Church, but I thought religious arguments were one of the things they specialised in.
Do you think that the religious argument is valid?
Well, it's absolutely valid for a person deciding what they would want. I don't know, perhaps you're a religious person, you have a certain view of the sanctity of life, and it would be wrong for you to ever have an assisted death. You might even, use your private capacity or even your media program to persuade other people that they should not want an assisted death. That's all fine. That's freedom of speech. That's you, living your life as you want to choose and trying to persuade other people. That's what makes our society healthy. But what you don't have the right to do is go to Parliament and ask politicians to use the law to impose your morality on others.
Do you think that there will be room for escalation in this bill? Say it does go through in decades' time, we will see escalation where some of those safeguards actually won't be there anymore?
Well, I mean, it's kind of, again, this is the argument that people use when they've lost all the other arguments, because to say that the future might be different from the present is the easiest thing in the world to claim, and it's impossible to prove. But look, I mean, you know, people like to point to Belgium and the Netherlands where over 20 years they've expanded the eligibility. But if you look at the country that, or at least the state of America that has had this legislation the longest, well, the Oregonians have had this since 1998, coming up to their 20th anniversary. They have the same language, culture and shared history as New Zealand, being an English-speaking common law democracy in the New World, and they have made no changes at all in 20 years.
Talk about the positives in Canada and Oregon and other places in the world. Talk about the positives that this bill's seen.
Well, one of the interesting things that I've heard from Canadian friends, and I lived in Canada for 5 years, so I have a few, is that the whole conversation around death in Canada has changed. It's been destigmatized. It's out in the open. People are talking about how they'd like their death to be. All of a sudden, you're having a vastly more mature conversation about life and death. And I think that can only be a healthy thing, aside from the specific instances of people who are being relieved from needless suffering and being able to take control of how they go and when they go. It's their life and it's their choice.
Is this more of a fear of change or a fear of what they think a bill may be?
I think there's a whole lot of things going on there in the opposition to this bill. So there are the Simon O'Connors of the world. We all know why he's opposed. He's not saying it, but you know, let's just leave that there. Then there are people who have genuine misapprehensions about the bill. They have heard things about it that may or may not be true, but you know, they've got every right to be concerned, and I've got every obligation to try to put the case to people that, you know, it may not be as bad as it sounds, particularly when you get down to the nitty-gritty of the detail. But then there's people who are completely informed. They understand perfectly what the bill's about. They have legitimate concerns, and you know, that I'd invite them to come and you know, make submissions to the Select Committee, and I suspect that the bill, if it's finally passed, will not be identical to the one that I put into Parliament at the beginning, back in September 2015. So, you know, there's a whole range. There's people who, just being dishonest, they have totally different motivations and they're fudging it. I don't care about them. There's people in the middle who have genuine concerns, but potentially once we have the conversation, they'll say, oh, okay, I didn't realise it worked that way, that's fine. And then there's people who are opposed and they have really constructive things to add. They understand the bill perfectly, and we may end up making some changes to accommodate them.
Do you think education is very important around this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's important around all issues, right? I mean, you know, I think that the whole area of death and planning, I guess your end of life care, you know, these are only going to become more important in New Zealand society, because medical science is getting so good that you can pretty much be kept alive forever if you think being alive means having a beating heart. If being alive means having a certain amount of dignity and control and capability, then you know, you've got to decide what you want. I'd highly recommend to people Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal. You know, Gawande endorses assisted dying laws in the book, but he also talks a lot about you know, the kinds of choices that people have to make, because yeah, your heart can beat forever, but that may not be the kind of life you want.
You mentioned the polls significantly saying that there was so much support. Do you think it would be unfair for it to be a conscience vote? Do you think a referendum, therefore, would be a more fair and just way to go?
Arguably, but the thing about referenda is that referenda only count if Parliament ratifies them. You know, referenda can't make laws in New Zealand. Only Parliament can make laws. So, you know, I'm going to vote to add a referendum to this bill. That's a deal I have with New Zealand First, that they will support it if I promote a referendum, because they believe it should be decided by the people. But, you know, ultimately, whether or not we have a referendum, it won't make any difference if we can't get a majority of parliamentarians. But yeah, you're right. You know, it's a shame that 75% of New Zealanders are in favour and only 63% of parliamentarians.
So how, therefore, if we do go to referendum, then is there going to be some form of education toward it for that grey area that don't understand it and have misconceived ideas of the bill?
Oh, absolutely. But look, I mean, you know, I don't imagine a great big scheme to educate people. I mean, I don't think the government should be telling people what to think. But you know, as a parliamentarian, as the leader of a political party and the sponsor of the bill, yeah, I mean, we're doing that all the time. You know, people should look at our website, lifechoice.org.nz. There's a whole lot of questions and answers there. You can add your own questions if things are unclear. You know, we're putting out videos from people who are very ill and support the bill, because I think it's important people see the reality that some people face under current laws. And you know, I'm happy to do shows like this on Pajama, and you know, basically do everything I can to try and help get, you know, accurate information out there.
So, and to recap over the things that people are getting wrong, what are people getting wrong in the you know, arena?
I think, well, it's quite varied, but I think the main thing is that you know, people are worried that this is something that will somehow be pushed on you, that you know, a doctor will decide for you. Well, that's not the case. A doctor doesn't decide. Only you can decide. The doctor may tell you that, you know, you're not ill or you're not mentally sound and say that you can't decide, but they won't decide for you. Similarly, you know, some people think that you know, people are going to be somehow subtly coerced into doing this. If you look overseas where it's been legalised, the places where assisted dying happens are the places that have the greatest wealth and prosperity. You know, the health district in Canada that uses this this law the most in the time they've had it is on Vancouver Island, where all the wealthy retirees are. These are people who, now I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but all I'm saying is that you know, the people that use these laws where they're legal are people who are articulate, assertive, have been getting their own way for most of their life, and they want to get their way in death as well. Similarly, older people, in opinion polling, older people are more in favour of this. So, you know, a lot of people think that it's something that gets pushed onto people. All the evidence is it's actually something that people who are used to making a lot of decisions for themselves choose.
And you mentioned the argument before, but it ties in with this, the argument that is made that you don't make the choice, the doctor makes the choice. Is that valid at all?
Well, I mean, look, you know, the doctor can disqualify you. You know, the doctor can say, you can go to a doctor and say, I'd like an assisted death, and the doctor says, well, sorry, you're not actually sick, and or you're not actually mentally capable of deciding, so I'm not going to sign that off for you. So the doctor can tell you can't have an assisted death, but they can't initiate the process. They can't recommend it. They can't force you to. They definitely can't force you to do it. But they can block you if they think you're not up to it.
A lot of people are worried about what the message is sending to assisted suicide. Sorry. Let me say again, what the message is sending to a suicide itself. Whether we're just giving from Peter to give to Paul, and just you know, is this going to see a promotion of the death culture in New Zealand?
Well, again, I think the best thing you can do is go back to the facts and the evidence from overseas. When I sat in on the Select Committee inquiry, you know, some of the members some of the MPs really desperately wanted to have assisted dying and suicide to be linked in the report, and the Ministry of Health officials said, well, we're sorry, but there's just no evidence for that. You may want to make that argument, but you know, you can only put stuff in the report that's actually true. And so if you read the report now, it very clearly states that you know, there's no connection between youth suicide rates and legalising assisted dying. I think the answer to that's pretty clear. Assisted dying laws are for people who are dying, who don't want to die, but given that they're dying, want to take control. Suicide is irrational and stupid. It's for people who are not dying, but do want to die, and are doing that and are irrational to want that.
Churches specifically, we come back to that again. The churches tend to focus around the vulnerable in New Zealand, and they're arguing that the vulnerable won't be protected by this, despite the safeguards in the bill. Where are the loopholes that they think there is?
Well, I think you'd have to ask them that. But I mean, if you take, I've had two people with significant disability in my family. One with Down syndrome. My mum had polio. They would not have qualified for an assisted death under this bill. Down syndrome is not something that's in an advanced state of decline. I mean, I don't even think it's grievous. It is irremediable, but decline? No, you'd never qualify. There's no way. Second, polio. Well, is it irremediable? Sadly, yes. Is it grievous? Some people might argue, but it's not an advanced state of decline in capability any more than anyone else gradually loses their mobility as they get older. So, when I talk about vulnerable people and disabled people, I've thought very hard about how people might be affected. And the thing is, by and large, people with disabilities, they may have a condition, but that's not what this bill's for. It's for people who are in an advanced state of decline.
In talking to someone about this bill and research for our chat today, a girl had cancer last year, in remission now, thankfully, and she wondered with this bill around the state of depression. Do you think that anyone that has a major condition is not depressed or has any mental sort of reservation? Because obviously that's safeguarded in the bill.
Well, the question is, are they capable of understanding, the nature of assisted dying? Someone who's depressed, by definition, has a distorted view of the future of their life, so they're not capable of understanding that. So, without knowing anything more about the specific case, putting aside the fact that she was 17, she wouldn't have been able to take her life. But I think the other thing is that, I think you'd have to be pretty irrational with cancer these days to end your life unless you were at a stage where it was really, really bad and that you were suffering to an extent that you knew there was no way back. Ultimately, that's the person's decision. But, if you thought there was even a chance of remission, wouldn't you hang on?
What's your hope for this select committee?
Well, I hope the select committee will actually travel overseas and study what's happened in Europe and in North America, because other select committees, the Quebec Select Committee went to Europe, the Australian state of Victoria, their select committee went to Europe and North America. So I hope that our select committee will actually do some study on this issue. I think that's really important. And I hope that they will listen and come back with constructive solutions to improve the bill, because I don't for a moment believe that the bill I put in is pretty good. It got sign-off by the Attorney General as being consistent with New Zealand's Bill of Rights, but I have no doubt that with the wisdom of crowds it can be made better.
Can you give us some stories of the people that are really excited for the potential with this bill?
Oh, yeah, well look, one guy, you can see some of these stories in the videos that we made and released earlier this week. One guy, funnily enough, is called David Seymour. He's also from Whangarei, and we used to get each other's phone calls mixed up sometimes. So David has motor neuron disease. The guy is dying. It's going to be a horrible, horrible death for him the way things are now. But look, this guy has been a prosperous, thoughtful, kind-hearted, public-spirited guy throughout his whole life. Why shouldn't he be allowed to get the choice?
Do you think that this bill will go through?
Yeah, my heart of hearts it will. I don't know if it will end up with a referendum appended to it. I don't know how much it will change through the select committee process, but I do think it will pass. I think the time has come.
What do you say to the people that are at the moment, really, really anxious about this and really, really wanting this to go through?
Look, you've got to, keep communicating. Communicate with those members of parliament. Communicate with the doubters. And if you keep communicating, I think that the facts are on our side, public opinion's on our side, and we will win the day. but you know, there's a lot of water to go under the bridge yet.
And what about those doubters? What do you say to them?
Oh, look, I think that they have nothing to fear. Their lives will not be changed by this bill. They can just ignore it. But you know, in return for them having the right to live their lives as they would want, they must be prepared to tolerate that other people see the world differently and would like to make different choices.
A lot of people worry about whether there will be deaths that occur that people didn't necessarily want and were pushed into or whatever by family. Is there room for that in this bill?
No, and the bill requires the doctors involved to interview family members and seek out any detection of coercion, and bear in mind that for failing to do that they can be liable in quite a serious way. So they're going to err on the side of caution there. But also you just have to look at the evidence. We've now had these kinds of laws for 20 years overseas. Everyone says that there's coercion going on because it's just, again, it's one of these things that's just the easiest thing in the world to claim and impossible to disprove. They say, oh, there's undetected coercion. Well, you can never prove that. But to the extent that it's been studied, there's just no evidence.
If doctors make wrong steps, what are the repercussions?
Well, the same as if they make wrong steps now. I mean, doctors can be liable for medical negligence. They can be punished quite severely.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, just look, thank you very much for taking the time to do a long-form interview on this. I think it's really important that we have media that are prepared to delve into the issues in great depth, and I hope that the editing will reflect that.
Rightio, thanks so much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Cheers.